Konnichiwa. That's Japanese for hello. Konnichiwa. See, I'm learning stuff too this semester. Anyway, we left off with prions, those proteins that are renegade. And let's talk about right now, to start off with, the cells of immunity and where we might find them. Leukocytes, white blood cells. We've talked about those. We know they're formed in the bone marrow, and we've talked about all these before. No need to take that up. But a couple of things here to expand upon. Leukocytes are involved in immunity. That's their job. The phagocytic leukocytes, neutrophils, and macrophages, they are, now the neutrophils circulate in the blood. They're phagocytic in the blood, but their main role is to leave circulation by diapedesis and follow a chemical trail to inflammation or infection by positive chemotaxis. That's their main role. Macrophages can do the same thing, but we also find them in other places, taking up their residence. And then we have the lymphocytes. It's time to expand on those a little bit. We have two letters. We have B lymphocytes and the T lymphocytes. The B lymphocytes are involved in humoral immunity. They're the ones that create, make, and produce tremendous numbers, very large numbers of antibodies. And so B lymphocytes, humoral immunity, and whereas the term humoral is somewhat antiquated in a lot of its uses, in this instance, it's spot on, because humors represent the fluid parts of the body, and antibodies can be found in almost all the fluids. Certainly the blood, certainly the interstitial, certainly the lymph, and they can make their way to pretty much any nook and cranny in the body, except the central nervous system and the cerebrospinal fluid. T lymphocytes are involved in what's called cellular immunity. They act directly. Talk a little bit about those later as well. And I mean, it's hard to come up with a favorite immune cell type, but I just like the name natural killer. Natural killer cells, they go around and they do exactly what the name sounds like. They kill off pathogens, and I picture, if I could see a picture of a natural killer cell, it would have a beard and sunglasses and that faraway look in its eye. Anyway, I digress. Where do we find these immune cells? Well, we find macrophages housed in select organs here and there. For instance, in the last chapter, we saw that they were housed in the spleen and lymph nodes. And even though they're macrophage is a macrophage, they get named for where they're at, where you find them. So alveolar macrophages are macrophages that patrol the lining of the lungs. The microglia, those are specialized macrophages for the central nervous system. They may be permanent residents of a tissue, meaning that they stay there. They're fixed. They hang out somewhere, like a lymph node, and they do their surveillance thing from there. They may be wandering macrophages on patrol. I keep saying that it's common to use military terms when it comes to immunity, because it really is like a battle. And so what we have, the fixed macrophages are like a guard shack or a checkpoint, whereas the wandering macrophages are more like a patrol, on a lookout, going around, investigating, probing, making sure that nothing is present that's not supposed to be. You see, this is not a game. It's a life or death issue. immunity is. And so we have, as I mentioned on the outset of this chapter, a multi-layered defense. In the connective tissues, we have mast cells. Things that go make noise in the night. Wonder what that is. Seriously, what is that? Oh, it's a dog. I'm a little jumpy, sorry. Mast cells are located in the connective tissue, and those are also, you can think of them as an alarm or a flare, whereas the mast cells are just hanging out there. They're particularly abundant in the dermis. I'll come back to that. And what they do is they have the signal molecules that the phagocytic cells follow. So there's the mast cell just happily hanging out, just doing nothing, just minding its own business. And then if some sort of problem occurs, like inflammation, injury, or an infection, then they release their signal molecules, which typically are things like a histamine. And then that rallies the troops and calls out the cavalry. They're typically in close proximity to small blood vessels. Contemplate that for a second. How would that help? So they are containers of signal molecules. They sound the alarm, call out the cavalry, rally the troops. By what mechanism is the alarm spread? The circulatory system. Where are the cavalry going to come from? Where is that hill that the cavalry come over? The circulatory system. Okay, let's look at that next bullet point there. They're abundant in the dermis, the dermal layer of the skin. Why would that be? Where is the threat going to come from? Typically, the threat comes from outside. So, we get a cut, get a splinter, we get a mosquito bite, we get a something. Could be a lot of different things. It's likely to happen in the dermis of the skin. The mast cell releases its histamine signal molecules into the bloodstream, and then charge! That, by the way, is actually the bugle call that means charge for the cavalry. Maybe one day I'll tell you how I know that. And where else are mast cells located? Think about the story of the skin I just told you, and we find them abundant in the mucosa of the respiratory tract, the digestive tract, the urogenital tracts. All places that are open to the outside. Now think about where we get infections. Where do people get infections? Does an infection typically just jump on, from the skin? 1 minute you're looking at your skin, and the next minute you go, oh, something's infected there. Not usually. It's usually due to one of the openings in our skin. Like, you might look at your skin and say, oh, look, I got something going on there, like a zit. A zit is a sweat gland that gets infected or clogged up, but that's an opening in the skin. Do people get eye infections? Let's start from the top, work our way inferior. People get eye infections? Pink eye? Yep, all the time. Ear infections? Obviously. If you have any children yourself, you know that they get ear infections all the time, and then usually they manifest themselves at 5:30 on a Friday night. This is like clockwork, isn't it? All right. Do people get nose infections, sinus infections, sore throats, strep throats, upper respiratory infections? You following me here? What about urinary tract, UTIs? Now we're going to roll around to the very last opening that I haven't covered yet. It's that one. And infections can also be found anally. There just doesn't seem to be as common as the other places. So as I'll mention here in a little while, the skin actually is our number one defense. Now we also, if something breaches our skin, our barrier defense, we also find mast cells in the connective tissues surrounding organs, uh, mostly to detect inflammation, not so much infection. Yes, infection does cause the mast cells to release their their chemicals. Now we have a couple to the immunity. When we say immune system, it's not really system. It's an integrated defense with all the different systems are somehow, some way involved in protection, because it is actually the most important mission to keep the body alive. So we can break immunity down into two factors: innate and adaptive. Innate immunity, innate means you're born with it. It's just there. We have it. Um, it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't adapt. It's just there. It's effective against all the different types of infectious agents that were discussed in the previous presentation. Doesn't matter whether it's a virus, a bacteria, a parasite, the innate immunity works against all of them. If something gets past the innate immune system or structures, then we have the ability to adapt and overcome. But that's only if something breaches our defenses. The most, like it says here, the most important parts of innate immunity that we're born with are barriers of the skin and the mucosal membranes. And the mucosal membrane is a membrane that's open to the outside world. A serosal membrane is an internal membrane. So the mucosal membranes are the eyes, the ears, the nose, the urinary tract. They're there, and they just act. They don't require previous exposure to a foreign substance. So we don't have to have any experience with a harmful agent. We just have this set up. So one of the things that I liken this to is, let me see if this works. Can I actually do this? The walled cities of old. I was very fortunate one day to visit this place. I actually stood right where that picture was taken. There's a little place called Avila in Spain. Pretty small. They're in central Spain, not terribly far from Madrid. It was a nice day trip. And a quick bit of Spanish history. That the Spanish Peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, has been occupied by people since the Stone Age. And in the about 200 BC, the Romans came and they took over. And then in around 400, a group called the Visigoths, where we get Goth, from Northern Europe came, and they decided they were going to make Spain their home. And in the year 711, the Arab invaders from Northern Africa came across the Strait of Gibraltar and took over and took control over most of the Iberian Peninsula. And then there was this time in Spanish history called the Reconquista, where the forces that had, the people, mostly Christians, that had been pushed in northern Spain, were battling the Islamic forces in the southern, and it went on and on and on for hundreds and hundreds of years. So we're talking, it started in 711, and it went on for a while. Anyway, Avila kept getting run over by all these people. You know, they'd get run over from the people from the north, pushing the Arabs to the south. The Arabs would come and they would push the Christians to the north, and it just it just kept going on and on and on and on. They got tired of being in the middle, and so they put up these walls in about 1000 AD. And after that, the forces that were fighting each other, the Christians and the Islamic forces, they just went around the town, and the walls were never breached, and the fighting just left Avila out of it, and it was a barrier defense. It kept things out. It didn't matter what it was. It didn't matter whether these invaders were Islamic. It didn't matter whether they were Christian. Well, I didn't mean to click on that, but yeah, there's a there's a shrine there to Saint Teresa of Avila, pretty famous in Catholic history. Anyway, so politics and religion aside, the people of the city decided to build this wall as a defense against whatever and whoever, and it worked. The walls of Avila have never been breached. So let's see if I can go back to get this going again. Anyways, maybe. There we go. So that's what I'm talking about, non-specific. The innate immunity doesn't care what infectious agent is trying to sneak its way into our body. It acts as a barrier. That's the skin and the mucous membranes. We also then have non-specific cellular defenses, like a neutrophil or a macrophage. It don't care who you are or what you are or why you're there. It's going to eat you. It's going to phagocytize you. We have molecular internal defenses, molecules that are antimicrobial, that just do not promote the growth of bacteria or viruses. It doesn't matter. We don't have to even have ever seen anything. If another invader had come in, and by the way, the rest of that story is the Reconquista went back and forth in Spain until finally King, what the heck is his name? And Queen Isabella and King what's his face? They finally defeated the Islamic forces at Granada in 1492. That's an interesting year, isn't it? That's the same year that they sent Christopher Columbus. Why can't I remember that king's name? Don't you hate not being able to remember something, especially when you're taking a lab exam? It was the real royal wedding of the century when a real king and a real queen got married. It was the King of Aragon and Queen Isabella. Anyway, I digress, but Spanish history is really fascinating. So it doesn't matter if somebody else had come into town, whether let's say it was the Jews, and they defeated the Islamic and the Christian forces. The walls of Avila would still have defended the town against the Jews or against anybody. And as a matter of fact, one of the interesting facts about Spanish history is until 1492, the Jews just lived side by side with everybody. Other Christians and the Muslims were fighting, and they didn't bother with the Jews. The only thing is, if you were Jewish, you had to pay a higher tax rate. So, isn't that interesting? So the response immediately to a potentially harmful agent. So that means the wall is just there. You don't have to put it up. It's already there. And whatever the infectious agent is, it's not going to get past, or at least hopefully it doesn't. If it does, then we have adaptive immunity. That means that now we're going to create a specific defense for whatever got through. It'd be like, okay, this species of bacteria is here. How are we going to defeat this particular species of bacteria? And we have more to. I'll have more to say about adaptive immunity at the end of the chapter. Later on, it's actually it's fascinating and very germane to today's events. It takes several days. That's generous. It might take a couple of weeks, maybe even up to 3 weeks to be effective. Because when something, first of all, when something gets past the innate defenses, when past our barrier defenses, we have to recognize that something has breached the defense. Then here we go with more military terms. Then we have to capture one of the enemy. Then we have to interrogate one of the enemy and find a weakness. Then we have to, when we find a weakness, then we have to mount a defense specifically for that particular specific defense weakness. And then we have to develop, once we've figured out how to make a weapon against this particular foreign object, then we have to mass produce it. And all of those things take time. This is a fantastic graph. Normally, something this complicated, I would just slide by, but this shows really nicely the difference between innate and adaptive. So the innate immunities, the things we're born with and can respond really quickly, are our skin and mucosal membranes that prevent entry. And if something does get past our barrier defenses, then we have phagocytic cells that are not specific. They'll just kill whatever. Then we have some chemicals, interferons and complements. Those are going to come up in conversation later, but those can work against a variety of different offenders. And then we also have some physiological responses that help with inflammation and fever, and I'll talk with you a little bit about those, how that happens as well. And then our last line of defense, which is actually very good, adaptive immunity. It's a delayed response, but to a specific antigen. Now, we haven't defined the word antigen yet. Antigen is short for antibody generating substance. Okay, so at the moment, for now, I'll emphasize this a bit later. I'm going to say antigens are bad. Antibodies are good. Antibodies are the proteins that our body creates to fight a specific invader. You hear a lot about these in the news right now. People who have had the COVID virus develop antibodies against the COVID virus. People are talking about collecting those antibodies through plasma donations, and those antibodies can potentially be used not as a vaccine, but as a treatment for somebody who's having serious issues. So antibodies are good. They're anti the bodies that are bothering us. The antigen is bad. That's the organism or substance that's making us create the antibodies. The antibodies, in that previous example, I said it takes a while for us to notice that something has breached our defenses, to capture an enemy, interrogate it, find a weakness, and then create a weapon against that weakness. That weapon is an antibody. So antibodies are good. The antigens are bad. So that we have the T lymphocytes and the cell-mediated. I'll talk about that later. We have the B lymphocytes at the humoral immunity. I've addressed that a little bit. The B lymphocytes are the ones that turn into plasma cells and turn into the weapons factory. They're the ones that make the antibodies. So that's a really nice place to stop with this particular presentation, and I will come back a bit later. So until then, sayonara, which of course, sayonara is Japanese for goodbye. Who knows what language I'll come up with next? Quite frankly, I don't even know.